Shalom everybody, James Trim here. Today I want to talk to you about the Karaites. Was Yeshua a Karaite? And what were the Karaites? When did they originate? And was Yeshua a Karaite? We're going to get to the truth about these things. But before we get started, I want to encourage everybody to please donate to support these videos. You can do that by clicking on the donate link in the video description, or by making donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. Also, I want to encourage you to like our videos, subscribe to this channel, click that notification bell so that you'll get notifications when new videos come out. And also participate in the discussions and comments in the let us know what you think in the comments section down below. All these things are things that the YouTube algorithm takes into account when it decides what videos to recommend to new viewers, and we want to get recommended to new viewers, so help us out there. Also, we're trying to build our subscriber numbers. We did finally reach 3,000, and that's not good enough. We want to get to 3,500, 4,000, etc. So help us build those subscriber numbers. You can also help by sharing these videos on your social media, Facebook, Twitter, etc., and with your friends through various social media accounts. Okay. As usual, as is often the case, we have handouts for this video. If you want to follow along, you can click on the handouts link in the video description, and that'll bring up a PDF file that you can print out and use to follow along if you'd like. So let's go back to the 1st century, the Second Temple era, the time of Yeshua. And let's see what Second Temple Judaism was. In this time period, we had 3 major sects of Judaism. We had the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And Josephus writes of the Pharisees, and this is on our first handout, in his book Antiquities of the Jews. Now, Josephus was a 1st century Second Temple era Jewish writer. So he was there. And he says, "The Pharisees have delivered to the people a great many observances by succession from their fathers, which are not written in the law of Moses." That's Antiquities, Book 13, Chapter 11, Section 6. The Pharisees later became known or evolved into what we call Rabbinic Judaism, and they eventually wrote these traditions, known as the Oral Law, down in the Mishnah and in the Talmud and in the Midrashim. These works contain the Oral Law recorded by the Pharisees. The core of the Talmud is the Mishnah. It was compiled around 250 CE by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi from earlier oral and written traditions that preceded him. It cites the opinions of rabbis and teachers who lived in the generation immediately following Ezra and Nehemiah up until the time of its composition. The Talmud was compiled around 500 CE. There's actually 2 Talmuds. The Jerusalem Talmud from about 100 years before that, and then the Babylonian Talmud. And it consists of the Mishnah. They each consist of the Mishnah written in Hebrew and commentary to the Mishnah known as the Gemara surrounding it written in Aramaic. Okay, this is the Oral Law. These are the traditions that Josephus is speaking of, the Pharisaic traditions. Okay, the Sadducees rejected these traditions. Josephus continues and says, "For that reason it is that the Sadducees reject them and say that we are to esteem those observances to be obligatory which are in the written word, but not to observe what are delivered from the traditions of our forefathers. So the Sadducees rejected the oral Torah. Now, there's a reason for this. The Sadducees had to reject the oral Torah because the Sadducees did not believe in an afterlife. They didn't believe in the resurrection. And it was hard enough to square these things, these apostate beliefs, with the written Torah. But it was impossible to square them with the oral Torah, with the traditions that had been handed down as Judaism from the time of Moshe, because they were at complete odds with that. So they had to reject the oral Torah. And so they did. By the way, the Essenes, like the Pharisees, also believed in oral Torah. They just had a stricter one than the Pharisees. Their beliefs, they believed the Pharisaic traditions were not strict enough. But it was only the Sadducees in the 1st century, in the Second Temple era, that rejected the idea of oral Torah. The Sadducees ceased to exist after the destruction of the temple. After the destruction of the temple, the Sadducees and Essenes both ceased to exist. Only the Pharisees and Nazarenes continued, and the Pharisees became, like I said, what we know today as Rabbinic Judaism. So it's important to realize that the only version of Judaism in the Second Temple era, at the time of Yeshua, that rejected the oral law was Sadducean Judaism. Now, it's really interesting is that if we look at things carefully, we'll see that Yeshua had a great following from former Essenes and from former Pharisees. In fact, the so-called Nazarenes, the original Jewish followers of Yeshua, were a combination of people that had come from Essene and Pharisaic backgrounds, particularly School of Hillel Pharisees versus School of Shammai. And they had also come from some from Essene backgrounds. But almost none of them had come from Sadducean backgrounds because they had nothing, there was just no commonality there. So Yeshua's original followers were Essenes and Pharisees, but not Sadducees. The only group in Yeshua's time that rejected the oral law is also the only group that rejected Yeshua all completely. I mean, in other words, almost nobody from that sect became followers of Yeshua. And that sect ceased to exist after the destruction of the temple. So who are the Karaites and where did they come from? Well, that's our next handout. And our next handout is titled The Origin of the Karaites. And for the origin of the Karaites, I'm going to quote from a couple of books that I actually inherited from my father that were there are a handful of books in my vast library that came from my father's library. And two of these are books on Jewish history. One of them, realized I was born in 1966, and so, and my father had me when he was older. And some of these books were old then, when my father had them. So the first book I'm going to cite or quote from, this is our second page of our handout, is a book titled The Outlines of Jewish History by Lady Magnus, revised by M. Freilander, Ph.D., second revised edition, Philadelphia, from the Jewish Publication Society of America, 1890. Okay. Quoting, the Karaite movement. Muhammad did not succeed in converting the Jews, but nevertheless the indirect influence of the faith he preached, helped perhaps a little by communal disputes, did produce a distinct sect among the Jews about the middle of the 8th century. We'll pause here. That's about the middle of the 8th century CE. In other words, over 800 years after Yeshua. In fact, the middle of the 8th century, right about 800 years. So almost 1,000 years later. Almost 1,000 years after the Sadducees ceased to exist. Around 800 years after the Sadducees ceased to exist. This new group arose. Okay, picking back up. A party in Islam rejected the stricter traditions of the Sunnah, and a party among the Jews about the same date grew openly impatient with the rabbinic ruling of the Talmud. Rebellion of any sort is catching, and there can be little doubt that each set of grumblers helped the other. The man who first gave expression to the Jewish discontent with tradition was a certain Anan, A-N-A-N, son of David, Anan ben David, a native of Babylon. Anan had a personal grievance of his own, a position which gives a certain point of eloquence to any general sense of injury. He had wished to be made the Reish Galut, or Galuta. In other words, the patriarch of the dispersion, of the diaspora. But the election had come and gone, and he had been passed over, and worst slight of all, a younger brother of his own had been appointed to the office. So he wanted to be patriarch of the Babylonian Jews, basically, the Jews that lived in the Babylonian area. And there was an election, and he lost. But not only did he lose, his younger brother won. What an insult. And so he wasn't real happy. Picking back up, continuing to read. So Anan, disappointed of being patriarch of his people and of leading them on the old Orthodox road, determined to become their spokesman and advocate in a new direction. Now, turning to another book that was I still have from my father's library, Stranger Than Fiction, A Short History of the Jews from the Earliest Times to the Present Day, by Lewis Brown, New York, Macmillan Company, 1932, pages 200 through 201. Anan ben David was a learned Jew of high station in Babylonia. Indeed, he was an heir of the prince of the exile. But about the year 762, I need to correct myself because when I said the 8th century before, I wasn't thinking clearly. Of course, the 8th century is the 700s, and so 762 is about 700 years. Just under 700 years after the Sadducees ceased to exist, and over 700 years after the time of Yeshua. So it says, about the year 762, when it came his turn to succeed to that office, the rabbis of the day elected his younger brother in his stead. And when Anan found he had been cheated out of what he considered his birthright, the commotion raised by him rocked the whole Jewish world. A new sect, almost a new religion, was founded by him. Anan declared war on the Talmudic law, taxing it with being all false and ridiculous. Okay, so the Karaite sect didn't exist until 762 CE or 762 AD. Over 700 years after the time of Yeshua. The only anti-oral law sect of Judaism at the time of Yeshua was the Sadducees, and the Nazarenes, the original followers of Yeshua, were certainly not Sadducees. They definitely believed in the afterlife. They definitely believed in the resurrection. They were not Sadducees. There's a great deal of evidence, and we've made many videos about these things before, that they came from a combination background of people that came from school of Hillel Phariseeism. And in fact, Paul even said, I am a Pharisee, Acts 23:6. And people that came from an Essene background. But they absolutely positively didn't come from a Sadducean background. And they didn't come from a Karaite background because, get this, there were no Karaites in the 1st century. Yeshua and his followers were not Karaites. They were an unlikely union of School of Hillel Pharisees and Essenes. The efforts of Nehemiah Gordon, who was a Karaite, and others to try and paint Yeshua and his original followers as Karaites is blatantly anachronistic. It's a blatantly anachronistic venture into historic revisionism. There's just no historic basis for it whatsoever. It's absurd. There were no Karaites in the time of Yeshua, and the only party, the only sect of Judaism that did reject the oral Torah at that time were the Sadducees, who absolutely were not had virtually no connection to any of Yeshua's original followers. All right, so I hope that that clears up. So I'll go ahead and comment a little bit further. Why is it that in the Hebrew Roots movement there has been such a willingness to follow Nehemiah Gordon, who, by the way, is a Messiah rejecter, doesn't believe Yeshua is the Messiah, and in Karaite Judaism? In fact, I'll even go so far as to say that there's little Hebrew roots without oral Torah, without traditions, because if you reject all Jewish traditions and simply accept the written text of the scripture alone, that's sola scripta Protestantism. That's nothing new. And sola scripta Protestantism actually originated because of a movement amongst Christians to emulate the Karaites, who were themselves emulating the group of Muslims who were rejecting Islamic tradition known as the Quranists. In fact, the word Karaite and the word Quranist are parallel and come from the same roots. Okay? So a lot of people coming to the Hebrew Roots movement come from Protestantism and sola scripta thinking. And because Protestantism rejects Christian traditions, which, by the way, are usually wrong anyway. Catholic traditions are not Jewish traditions. But because of that, it's very easy for them to not let go of their old baggage and to try, they're very easy to fall in with and accept an idea of rejecting traditions. But the problem is that the whole concept is blatantly anachronistic historical revisionism, trying to make Yeshua in the 1st century part of a sect of Judaism that didn't exist until 762 CE. It's absurd. Okay? So, Yeshua wasn't a Karaite. His followers weren't Karaites. And they were not part of the Sadducees either, which were the only group of Jews in the Second Temple era that were rejecting oral law. All right, once again, I want to encourage you to please donate to support these videos. You can do that by clicking on the donate link in the video description. And you can also do that by sending donations by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. And you can also please help us out by liking these videos, subscribing to this channel, click that bell, a notification bell, so you'll get notifications when new videos come out. Let us know what you think in the video, in the comments section. and participate in the discussions in the comments, and all these things help YouTube's algorithm decide to recommend us to new viewers. So help us also build our subscriber numbers up. We're up to 3,000 subscribers, and we want to obviously build that up to more. Also recommend these videos and share them on your social media accounts, Facebook, Twitter, etc. Until next time, Shalom.